Hello there, and this is Richard from Silent Peak, and today I'd like to show you my frequent workflow for editing a photo in ACDSee Ultimate 2022. Now we start today with our wee New Zealand fantail, and immediately we can see that the photo is much too dark. If we look over in the histogram, we can see that most of the pixels in the image are towards the left, which again reflects the fact that this image is much too dark, much underexposed. So I'm going to go to the Tune and General tab, head to the Exposure slider and start pulling that to the right. This will make our photo brighter and brighter. And if you look at the histogram, you can see that sort of mountainous region is getting pulled towards the center, which is exactly what we want. Now, if you go too far, you'll actually drag the image outside of range, which is what we like to call highlight clipping. So we just want just enough that the image is brighter but not overdone. Now I quite like that, but nevertheless, despite my best efforts, some of the image is still overexposed, still clipped. So heading to this highlight slider, if I pull this to the right, I can start to recover the highlights while leaving the rest of the image where I just put it. And there we go. Now, a consequence of changing exposure and recovering highlights is that we're squashing the image together. In other words, we're shrinking the distance between the darker tones of the image and the brighter tones, and that leads to a certain sort of flatness. So the best way to resolve that is with tone curves. If you're new to tone curves, I recommend you start with an S-curve. And we do that by just clicking your mouse on the line and creating these 3 dots. This one is controlling your darker pixels or shadows. These ones are your mid-tones, so sort of the mid-brightness. And these ones are your highlights, so that's the brightest pixels in your image. Starting with this one, we click and we pull it down, and that will make the darker tones darker. The mid-tones, I'm going to give those a slight boost. And then the highlights, a little bit brighter. And that is looking much better. If we look at the original image at this stage, we can see quite an improvement. If you look at the image itself and look at the histogram, particularly the histogram, you can see now the histogram is sort of perfectly distributed across the range. The other problem I have with this image is the composition. So I'm going to go to the geometry. And you can see here that we've got a very nice photo of bird, and then we've got all of this to the right that's really not doing much for the bird or for us. So I'm just going to stick with the 2:3 ratio and just pretend that I had a better zoom lens than I actually had, and give the bird the center of attention it deserves. Finally, once the image is bright and colourful, I can apply a little bit of sharpening. So I like to add a little bit of sharpening and then increase the radius ever so slightly. Don't go overboard with sharpening. The challenge you'll run into if you do is that you'll create various different artifacts, halos and strange pixely outlines on your image. And just to make sure that's not precisely what you've done, just click around, pay particular interest to the edges of your image, and just make sure that nothing is looking particularly artificial. In this case, it's all looking rather good. And then finally, a little bit of noise reduction. Again, something you don't want to overdo. If we take noise reduction to extreme, we can see that we lose nearly all of the detail within the image. It gets rid of the noise, but also the detail. So we're just going to be very, very subtle. It really doesn't have to be a lot. And the last thing I like to do is a post-crop vignette. So basically, I like to simulate having bought a good lens, simulate having a bad lens. So I like to apply a little bit of vignette, and that sort of creates this sort of shadow effect. And again, that's just for the sake of giving the photo a little bit of 3 dimension by creating the vignette, I darken the edges relative to my subject in the center. That sort of provides the illusion that the sort of central subject, the fantail, is sort of popping out of the photograph. And finally, a bonus trick for you guys is the color wheel. I don't know if you've used the color wheel yet. It's exclusive to 2021 and 2022 editions, but it enables us to pick a color within the photo and single it out for adjustment. So in this case, I'm going to make the green more saturated and more green and add a little bit of contrast to boot. And if we look at the difference here, before color wheel and after color wheel. And at this stage, I consider that image largely the finished article. Now, the workflow you've just seen is pretty typical. Now, some images do require specialist attention and a different workflow, but the workflow you've just seen is the one I use 90% of the time for 90% of my images. It translates very well into all kinds of software. It's not just unique to ACDSee, aside from the color wheel, of course. And feel free to use any amount of this workflow for your good selves. If you prefer a different workflow, please put it in the comments below. I'd be glad to try it. But I hope you found that useful, and I wish you the very best of days. Thank you. Bye-bye.